I consider myself somewhat of a casual Sonic fan. I was mostly into the series in the PS2 era, but since then I've skipped a good chunk of the games because they just didn't seem to have much going for them. With Sonic Frontiers, it's great to have a new game in the franchise that has not only piqued my interest enough to try it out, but one that most people seem to be having a great time with. But I'm not here to celebrate Sonic finally getting a fun new game. My focus is entirely on the visuals and tiny hidden details the artists behind this game put in that you would never normally notice. This video is going to be pretty much spoiler free, mostly focusing on just the first area of the game with very brief mentions of the second and third areas. I also won't say anything specific about the story or any of the bosses here. If you do want more videos that cover those topics, all you need to do is let me know by watching this one. First of all, let's talk about the cat in the room. The pop-in in this game is pretty horrendous. Just to give you some context, all the footage here is from the PC version of the game with all settings maxed out, except shadows because I don't have enough VRAM. My specs are on screen right now. Yes, they are getting extremely outdated at this point, but overall they run the game just fine. The worlds themselves are mostly pretty basic terrain, with the cool stuff like springs and grind rails crudely copy and pasted on top. They rarely feel like they belong where they're placed, and as you run through the world, they often appear right in front of your face. We've had open world games for so long that I honestly don't think there's an excuse for a huge company like SEGA to have such disruptive pop-in like this. Even a slight fade effect on these objects would have helped a bit, but instead the way the world loads in just feels unfinished, to be honest, and I do think it has a pretty negative impact on immersion, especially in instances where it's directly affecting gameplay by not loading in things you need to see soon enough. The way the grass loads in during this cutscene is really distracting in my opinion, and I really don't think it's a good look to have this kind of thing right at the start of a game. Complaints about the flying grind rails littering the sky was the first thing I heard about this game, and I have to agree in terms of visual design it is an issue. What's interesting about this is that at the start of the game you can see how this grind rail is actually supported by rocks protruding from the side of the cliff face, and another one here is also built into some rocks in the landscape. Simple changes like this stop these elements feeling out of place, but the further you get into the game, the less attention is paid to small details like this, eventually leading you to barren areas filled with random stuff suspended in the air all around you. That said, these sections of the game are fun. As you run around, you'll constantly find springs and rails that take you on a roller coaster ride, often with well-designed fixed camera segments that keep you on your toes, and then seamlessly transition back into regular gameplay. While overall the world does feel quite generic, the more I looked, the more I started to appreciate its design. Take this starting area for example. You start in between these two cliffs, creating a corridor where you can only move forwards and backwards. Anyone experienced with games will run through this with no problems, but it's important for a designer to always keep in mind that there will be people with little to no video game experience playing this, and so limiting your options to begin with helps everyone adjust before moving into the open world. The next area is a little more open, allowing you to explore a bit, but it's still primarily a straight line, clearly guiding the player as they get the hang of the game. It's also worth noting that the nearby grind rails clearly stand out from the rest of the scenery, so in this area they're specifically set up to take you to objectives you need to complete before moving forwards. As you continue through this area, it opens up more and more, pushing you to try alternating routes and rewarding exploration, until eventually you arrive at the big open fields of Kronos Island. Even at this point though, the game doesn't want the player to feel lost, so you start at a vantage point with at least 4 obvious landmarks to head towards in clear view, each of which slightly further into the background than the last. While it does feel quite barren, the strong contrast of the sands to the solid blue sky in Ares Island really impressed me when I first saw it, and the lighting looks great in every area as day turns into evening and eventually to night. The sunset and sunrise both add some really nice pinks into the color palettes too. One great detail here is how visibility is affected by different times of day and different types of weather. When it's dark and rainy, the atmospheric perspective on these faraway hills is pretty strong, essentially meaning they blend into the color of the sky. But when the sun comes out, you can clearly see all the way into the distance. In real life, that's just how light and our eyes work. But here a team of developers had to work hard to get this detail right, knowing that if they did their job properly, the point would be for most people to never notice. It just looks how you'd expect it to. And you know, these worlds do feel pretty basic and sorely lacking in style, but honestly there's some really nice looking areas. The water in this game looks great, so the rivers and reflective surfaces in the rainy areas have some really great atmosphere to them. The water is really good at reacting to impacts as well. I love the fields of flowers you come across every so often, and I love the mystery of this world's history that's subtly hinted to with the Cocoa architecture and Eggman technology that's scattered across the landscape. This area has a really cool atmosphere with the blades of grass flying in the wind. Is there a lot of open empty space that doesn't really serve a purpose? Yeah, not really actually. If you made the levels in a Mario game twice as big, it would serve no purpose other than wasting your time, but this is Sonic. If the level is twice as big, the game can allow you to go twice as fast, and zooming through the worlds at maximum speed is just so much fun. In fact, I think this is the first time I felt like Sonic's speed has actually been done justice in a 3D game. Speaking of which, Sonic is of course your focus here, and he feels amazing to play as. Speed aside, it's important to make sure he properly interacts with the world to make sure the whole thing feels believable and solid to the player, which is achieved through a ton of specific animations you probably wouldn't notice in regular gameplay. For example, you can see here after jumping from the dash panel, Sonic actually throws his legs in front of his body to brace for impact, so the momentum from him landing won't cause him to fall forwards. He also really leans inward with his hands towards the ground while taking tight turns, and on grind rails he leans forwards and backwards to accurately adjust his balance. One of my favorites is this quick animation where Sonic will start to spin after going through a boost ring, and then when he impacts with the ground he actually lands on his hands before forward rolling back to his feet and instantly running again. There's so much cool detail packed into sections of gameplay like this, but it's so fast it can be hard to catch. The amount of unique ways Sonic can interact with the world does cause some issues sometimes, like his legs breaking here, but this isn't a complaint since again you're unlikely to notice this in normal gameplay. His model is pretty nice too. Like the world itself, my main complaint here is that it's lacking in style, but for what it is, it looks just fine. There's a lot of detail on his shoes this time around, which I really appreciate, and the character acting is actually pretty good during the in-game cutscenes. Everyone's very expressive, which is generally something open world games with in-game dialogue don't put much effort into. I would like to see more visually impressive pre-rendered cutscenes, since that's something Sonic tends to do really well, but I haven't finished the game yet, so maybe that's something we'll see later on. One really nice detail you're likely to miss about Sonic is the subsurface scattering effect on his ears during specific lighting scenarios. Subsurface scattering is when the light goes through the outer layer of an object and bounces back out containing a different color from underneath. The most common example of this on a human is where light goes through the ears and fingertips and you'll see a bright red color from your muscles and blood come out to the surface. And that's exactly what's happening with his ears here. So you can actually see his blood in Sonic Frontiers, which is pretty cool. So a lot of effort has clearly been put into making Sonic not only react to the world, but in a way that's generally really cool. Like how his momentum doesn't just stop after running at high speeds. He strikes a cool pose and then quickly spins around. What's just as important though is that the world reacts to Sonic in turn, and there's also a lot of effort put in here. Check out how each surface reacts differently when Sonic is running across it. If you're in a grassy area in the rain, water will spray up from the grass, and in the desert his shoes will flick sand into the air, leaving footprints behind. On the grind rails, the sparks really glow, and there's a lot of examples like this of lights looking really nice in this game, especially at night. Speaking of lighting, it's common for Sonic games to switch between 2D and 3D, but there's a really cool way of handling this in Chaos Island. Generally having the player locked into a 2D section in a 3D world will result in a lot of detail in the background that confuses the composition of the stage and makes it harder to tell what you can and can't interact with. Here the lighting is adjusted to make Sonic and the stage dark, contrasting the much lighter background. It simplifies the scene into a binary of foreground and background, making it more intuitive to interact with the world as if we're now playing a 2D platformer. The combat in this game is pretty awesome and gives you the tools to quickly take down unique enemies in different ways. It's interesting just how much Sonic's limbs stretch when he kicks and punches, and I love how much impact the visual effects and camera shake give these hits. I'm a huge fan of how the cyberspace areas are designed too. I love the glitchy backgrounds with random elements spreading infinitely back into the distance. It makes these areas feel huge and kind of oppressive, which makes a lot of sense within the context of the story. I also really like the scanline filter on top of the background. It's interesting how it adds to the digital aesthetic they were going for, but is never placed in front of Sonic or the sections of the stage you're interacting with to make sure it doesn't become distracting. This effect is also on top of certain decorative elements like the plants here on Sky Sanctuary. It's a good way to balance having greenery, but still making sure it all feels digital instead of natural. The way you load into these stages is really cool too. Instead of beginning by standing still, Sonic is already running before you even start to play, pushing you to try and keep up that momentum. The way he runs out of the portal at maximum speed with absolutely no fear of what's ahead is perfectly in character, although if you watch this frame by frame, you can see Sonic actually loads in before the portal does, which I thought was interesting. The only major issue I've had with these levels was the one with the spinning platforms. Depth perception is extremely difficult here, and I think they should have put the shadows for things like red coins directly below them so they're position in space is easier to judge. With the realistic lighting distorting the shadows and pushing them to the side, they really don't help at all. Chromatic aberration is an effect caused by distortion at the edge of a camera lens. A lot of people tell me they don't like how this looks, but personally I think it's awesome, and clearly so did the artists behind Sonic Frontiers because it's used pretty liberally here, especially in the cyberspace levels and even more so in the fishing area. Here it gives the whole space a dreamlike energy, like it's not actually real, and when you put this area into context, that's pretty much perfect. You can also see a lot of chromatic aberration used in the UI for this game too, like the damage counters here. Video games are really deep. I haven't even scratched the surface of what Sonic Frontiers has to offer, like the cool architecture, NPC design, and some really incredible boss fights. And there's a bunch of other hidden details like the autosave icon looking like this graphic from the loading screens from Sonic Adventure. I realize this is a drawing of a spin dash, but considering it's drawn in the exact same way and the other adventure references in this game, I'm pretty sure this is intentional. Me and Deku Gamer talked about Splatoon 3 for over 2 hours and didn't even touch like the entire story mode. So it's clear to me that any game with passion behind it is a treasure trove of cool designs to discover. So if you do want me to keep diving into the design of Sonic Frontiers or any other game, let me know in the comments and I'll get right to it. If you want to improve your art for free, you can join the Learning to Draw Discord server and you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. So that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching and goodbye.